Hello, welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Sharp, and I have already recorded this podcast once, but realised I didn't have my microphone pointing the right way, and so it sounded tinny and echoey. So now we're going to have lovely, luscious audio, I hope. Today's topic is root pruning, and I said in the last episode about root cuttings that was a forgotten art. Well, this one certainly is definitely a forgotten technique in horticulture. It applies to hydroponics as well as growing in soil and soil-based growing media, so equally applicable. So stay tuned if you're not a hydroponic grower. And it's a forgotten art because certainly in horticulture, edible horticulture, because it was common practice in the Victorian times, but then with the advent of dwarf rootstocks in top fruits, so apples and pears, cherries, things like this, it wasn't used as much. So before we used dwarf rooting stocks for grafting, and if you don't know what I mean by that, then go to the episodes of this podcast about grafting. But basically, it's a dwarf variety that's a specific apple variety is grafted onto that keeps the shoots from growing too long. They were all discovered by the scientists at East Malling, where I did my PhD down in Kent, and they're still exactly the same varieties are used to this day. Very few dwarf rootstocks have been bred since then. But before they were discovered and widely popularised by the team at East Malling, every single apple and pear orchard used to root prune all their apples and pears in the winter. So they would dig them up and curtail the roots to stop them growing too long and produce more fruit when it came to growing. And some European pear orchards still continue to routinely root prune their trees to control vigour, what we call, too vigorous growth, but the technique is largely abandoned in the UK because of these dwarf rootstocks. You can actually graft a pear onto a quince, and that produces a dwarf rootstock. Top fact, you won't hear that anywhere else. So you can use root pruning to control growth on plants that don't have dwarf rootstocks or ornamental shrubs and trees, or where especially useful to do root pruning, where if you were to do a stem prune, it would produce unsightly wounds. So really ornate ornamental plants like magnolia. So my next door neighbour, for about 10 years, she would always massively hack down the stems of her magnolia tree in about February, March time, because it was spoiling her view as it came into leaf. But she cut off all the flowering stems and the tree looked terrible. What she could have done was root prune, and then she wouldn't have had to shoot prune because the vigour would be gone, but it would still produce lovely flowers and fruits. My new next door neighbour has now cut the tree down completely. So that is a real shame. So the reason why it controls shoot growth is because you've got to remember the plants normally have a root to shoot ratio of about 50-50. And that can change between species and soil type, but it's normally around 50-50. So if you cut it down, if you could cut the tree down completely, suckers would appear straight away and the plant would go really fast to produce new stems to try and rebalance that root to shoot ratio. But what you wouldn't see below ground is actually the root system would die off as well, because it just can't sustain such a big root system without that massive amount of photosynthesis. And if the reverse happens, so you root prune, then your stems just don't grow as fast because it can't sustain that size of a tree. Now, that's useful as, say, in ornamental plants where you don't want to be using damaging stems. If you're growing a crop and you imagine you don't want to be pruning the stems all the time for whatever reason because it doesn't look great, then perhaps root pruning is for you. Certainly the main crop, as it were, where root pruning is routinely used nowadays is bonsai trees, because once you've got that amazing shape in your bonsai tree, you want to keep it almost in a form of stasis. You don't want it to be pruning all the time. So if you root prune, you can stop the stems from growing out, you can stop the leaves from expanding, and you can keep it almost in that form of stasis. So bonsai root pruning, the best bonsai growers, the masters always use root pruning. And you will find that in all the specialized bonsai books. in some species, root pruning can actually help with plant defense. One example I've got here is the tropical trees in the bean family, the Fabaceae. They produce sulfur-containing compounds in their leaves, which are toxic to bacteria, fungi, nematodes, and insects in response to root damage. And this effect has been hypothesized to occur in other species when root pruned. However, root pruning does also open up a wound and thus a site of infection that could be a route of entry for soil-borne pathogens like Pythium or Phytophthora. And so I would not advise you perform it on species that are particularly prone to rots and heartwood rots, such as birches. Okay, so take it on a case-by-case basis. Now, you don't always have to pick the plant out of its container or out of the soil to root prune. There are actually containers you can buy, air pots. Have you ever seen these air pots with look like lots, I don't know how you describe an air pot. It's got like little holes in it and it's undulating. It's not flat like a normal plant pot. And the roots of the plant, the idea is that the roots of the plants go out to the sides of the pot, and then rather than circling round and round and round, they reach the end of the pot and then they're met with a hole and air. And obviously roots don't like air, and so they stop growing. And it's thought that that's almost like a root pruning effect. You also get white bags that many tree nurseries grow in, and the white lets in a bit of light, and that again curtails root growth and stops roots circling round and round the square bag that they're grown in, rather than the worst case scenario for a tree is that the roots just circle round and round and round, and then you buy the tree from the nursery, you put it into the hole you've dug for it, and the roots continue to go round and round and round. They don't expand, and the very, very, very poor anchorage of that tree, even after, say, 10 years, and it'll topple over. And when it topples over, you'll see it's just root bound. So when you buy a tree the roots are circled, or a shrub, you're supposed to pull the roots out, and it'll cause loads of root damage when you do that. But it's absolutely essential, because if you don't do that, it won't anchor into the soil. Just continue to go round and round and round. So root pruning can help with that. If you buy trees from a nursery where they've been grown in the soil, they're often lifted every year or every 2 years, because if they're destined to be dug up and transplanted, you can't just leave the tree in the ground for 5 years, because its roots will go 5 meters in every direction. And then when you dig it up, you'll be left with these really thick roots. And none of the thin nutrient and water absorbing roots will be near the plant that's been dug up. And so they'll all be lost. And so that's why you find trees and shrubs grown on nurseries will be dug up and almost root pruned every year or every 2 years for that reason, so that when they are eventually dug up for sale, they actually have lots of roots near the plant. So that's root pruning. Where else is root pruning used? You can root prune mother plants if you're keeping them for vegetative propagation. If you're taking clones or cuttings from mother plants, then you can root prune to just reinvigorate the root ball rather than it becoming root bound. So when you dig up, you can't keep a mother plant just continually in the same growing media for years and years and years. So if you've got any mother plants or any house plants and they're completely root bound, but you don't want to pot them up into a bigger plant pot, you just want to maintain them. As well as stem pruning, you can root prune them to maintain the plant, keep its vigor down, and then just control its size. I guess the same like large leafed figs. You could do the same rather than just hacking at the plant and destroying its architecture. That would be a good one. Fiddle leaf figs, as they're called. Those very ornate, very expensive houseplants. And then finally, one of the main reasons people root prune is to get root cuttings for plants where root cuttings are the main form of propagation. That's been Hydroponics Daily for today. The very, very lost art of root pruning. Maybe we can bring it back and rejuvenate it. If you found this useful, then please do leave an Apple podcast review. Please make sure you subscribe or press the follow button, and check out utrema.co.uk for all the fertilizers, biostimulants and biopesticides you might need on your mother plants, your apple plants, your bonsais. We've got something for you. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.